A woman's eligibility to be appointed as a judge in Shariah courts in Muslim societies has been a debated issue for decades. Appointing female judges to administrate Shariah law is derived from the Quran and Hadiths. Malaysia, Sudan, Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen and the Maldives have recently allowed qualified women to preside over Shariah courts. But Sri Lanka does not have a Shariah court. The judicial officer to administrate the Muslim matrimonial law in Sri Lanka, under the Muslim Marriage and Divorce Act, MMDA, is called Quazi. Since Muslim matrimonial law is from Shariah law, the appointment of women Quazi became controversial. Sri Lanka has a dual legal system regarding marriage and divorce. People have the choice of marrying under either the general law or the specific cultural law. The MMDA of 1951 provides the legality of marriage for Muslims when it takes place. The MMDA of 1951 is administered by the Quazi court system. Muslim women activists question the provision of a compulsory wali, male guardian, for Muslim women in the MMDA. They also consider MMDA preventing women from the appointment as Quazis, marriage registrars, adjudicators or members of the board of Quazis as discrimination based on gender. The Sri Lankan government has taken steps to address these issues and reform the MMDA since the 1970s. Al-Salan Jamiyatul Ulama, ACJU, was once a part of the MMDA Reform Committee. It worked with the MMDA team and provided necessary support and suggestions to review the required areas. However, ACJU broke away from the MMDA Reform Committee, disputing certain issues including women Quazi. The objection of ACJU to women Quazi was founded on the basis of verses of the Quran and Hadiths that were commonly quoted by opponents of women judges. ACJU totally rejected the proposal to reform the Act and to allow the appointment of Quazi on the basis of qualification. But women activists insist on changing the entire Quazi court system. Hence, the issue of women Quazi in Sri Lanka became a matter of kudos between ACJU and women activists. The Quranic interpretation tradition in Islam is a well-developed science and is still expanding. It is known as the sciences of the Quran and the basic principle of exegesis. This research focuses on Asbab al-Nuzul, occasion of revelation, a historical aspect of Ulum al-Quran. This study uses the contextualization method to review both groups, the group that permits women judges and the group that opposes women judges. Particularly, we will discuss whether the classical discussion on women judges can be taken as an analogy to decide the appointment of female Quazi in Sri Lanka. This research explores the conceptual interpretation of Quazi. Who could administrate the legal dignitaries related to the marriage and divorce of Muslims in Sri Lanka? Findings can be categorized under 5 themes. Women's conditions in terms of their academic and social contribution during the early period of Islam were pitiful because of limited opportunities for women to intellectual communities. One hardly found qualified women to be appointed to leadership positions. However, women who were qualified enough were appointed for various positions, and they played significant roles. For instance, the Prophet appointed Samra binti Nuhayk al-Asadiyya as the administrator of commercial law. As women's education becomes better today, the performance of girls is increasing, allowing women proceeding into the courts to become compulsory. Classical scholars might have considered gender as an important qualification for judges, as the post requires traveling to far distances alone. However, the situation has changed now, and the judicial boundary of a court has become constricted. The number of courts has also increased. Therefore, the context of the discussion of classical scholars is different from ours. Classical scholars debated the qualifications of a judge in the context of administrating an entire judiciary, including commercial, criminal and administrative, as well as other legal sections. Zubaydah once summarized the judge's duties during this period from the legacy of Mawardi and Ibn Khaldun. and scholars consider the judge as a delegation of the power of the political leader, making decisions in critical situations. However, the situation of Sri Lankan Muslims is totally different from this context. The classical scholars discussed the qualification of judges to administrate the entire Shariah law with the above-mentioned duties, while Sri Lankan Muslims discussed the qualification of Quazi, who can administrate a provision in the civil law of Sri Lanka. We noticed that deducing the law from the primary sources of Islam was the primary role of a judge during the periods of classical scholars. Classical scholars discussed the ability to process legal decisions independently on the basis of the primary sources of Islam. They thought mental and physical perfection are primary qualifications of a judge. In that perspective, many of the traditional scholars disqualified women from the office of judge due to their qualifications. However, the Muslims of Sri Lanka do not discuss the appointment of women Quazi in this context. Rather, they are discussing qualified women rising to the post of Quazi to administrate family disputes in the purview of the Muslim Personal Law Act. In order to ensure fair hearings, the Prophet Muhammad appointed his wives to listen to the women who sought solutions in family disputes. This is because women like to open up to other women and to discuss the issues related to family disputes, particularly complaints against their immediate family members. Many women demands women Quazi in order to ensure fair hearings, because they are afraid of being exploited sexually later. Women face many difficulties in Sri Lanka not because of unqualified male Quazi alone, however also due to the absence of women Quazi who can listen to them and understand their issues. In the absence of a precise direction in the Quran and Hadith on the qualification of a judge, the female judge has been a matter of discussion among Muslim scholars throughout history. The findings above show that the discussion on the qualification of judges with reference to gender seems irrelevant to Sri Lankan Muslims' discussion on female Quazi. In this perspective, it is inappropriate to prohibit the appointment of women Quazi in Sri Lanka based on classical scholars' discussion on the qualifications of a judge. Further, women have been appointed to many leadership posts, including judiciary as judges, to administrate Shariah law during the early period of Islam. In conclusion, we recommend the appointment of female Quazi in Sri Lanka if women are qualified enough in terms of academic and other requirements.